Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be doing class example number 5, which is found on page 95 of your slides. This is quite a straightforward question. All of the information is given, and it's just a good recap of all the concepts that we've discussed thus far. Right, whenever you get a process costing question, your first step is to draw a timeline. Now this timeline doesn't count any marks, but think of it as a summary of the question. It's a graphical representation of the information, and the more accurate you do your timeline, the easier it'll make it for you to answer the question correctly. Don't spend too much time on it. Just make sure that it's neat and that you can read what's there. Okay, we're told that we have two processes. The output of process 1 becomes the input into process 2. And the first bit of information is they tell us that the raw materials are added right at the start of process 1. In process 2, we're told that raw material is added at approximately, or sorry, not approximately, is added at 50%. They then tell us conversion costs are applied uniformly throughout the process. I'm not going to indicate that on my timeline because I'll just remember that, and that tends to be the norm. Then, on the next page, page 96, we get some numerical information. They tell us that process 1 has opening work in progress that is 25% complete. I prefer to add my opening work in progress on top of the timeline. Of course, there is no rule. It just makes it easier for me to remember what is opening and what is closing, and it makes the timeline less confusing. But you can do it any way that you prefer. They also tell us that for process 1, closing work in progress is 85% complete. Information for process 2 tells us that the opening work in progress is 70% complete, and the closing work in progress is 20% complete. This question doesn't have any losses in it, so that is the extent of the information that you need to put into the timeline at this point. The next step is to look at the units. Units coming into the process always need to be the same as the units coming out. So the units in this case, come from opening work in progress. For process 1, we had 7,500 units coming in. Then we had new units started during the process, 22,500. This is for a total of 30,000 units coming into the process. This is very important. It's very important to add that total, because units going out of the process also needs to equal 30,000. You need to account for all of the units that entered the process. So where do these units go? Some of them are what we call completed and transferred, and the other ones are in closing work in progress. Now we're given the units for closing work in progress, but we are not given the amount of units completed and transferred. However, in this case, it is our balancing figure. Now, at this stage, it's not necessary to say where they are transferred to. You can simply indicate it there. These units completed and transferred become the input into the next process. Sorry, that arrow of mine is a little bit short. So the input into process 2 consists of the opening work in progress that was given as 3,800 units, then as well as the units transferred in from process A, those same 25,000 units that you found over there. Now the question gave us this information, but it's just because it's a class example. I did not need to give you this 25,000. You could have calculated it over there already. In fact, it is highly unlikely that you will be given all of this information in an exam. We will try and hide a little bit of information to see if you understand the principles. For process 2, same principle applies. Input needs to equal the output. All the units that came into the process have to be accounted for. Again, the units going out of the process are referred to as completed and transferred. In this case, they're not transferred into the next process, they're transferred to finished goods. And we have closing work in progress, incomplete work. Again, the figure is given. 6,900 units were incomplete. We're not told how many units were complete, but it is simple to calculate because it is our balancing figure. Right, very simple timeline. Okay, this was step 1, a summary of the unit information and a timeline. The question asked us to calculate or to prepare a process costing statement for using both the FIFO method as well as the weighted average method. Now it's worth noticing that your timeline can be the same for both methods, even though you don't need to indicate the opening work in progress for the weighted average method, but it doesn't hurt to put it there. I'm first going to do the weighted average method. After that, I will show you the first in, first out method. Now it's very, very important to indicate which one you are doing. It's unlikely that a question will ask you to do both, as there just generally is not enough time in an exam, but it's possible. So clearly indicate which one you're doing because both require slightly different principles. When we do the weighted average method, we assume that the opening work in progress and the current year's production, the current year's new production, the units that were started, are all thrown together, and we calculate a weighted average for these new units. So in step 2, on the weighted average method, we start calculating rands. Now we're going to look at all of the rands that were input into this process. Our first ingredient, if you want to put it that way, is the raw material. And our second ingredient, if you want to call it that, is the conversion cost. Now, because this is the weighted average method, we're going to add the costs of the opening work in progress to the current year's costs to get a total cost. This information is given in the question. You don't need to calculate any of this. It will not necessarily be given in an exam question. This is just because it's a class example. The principle, however, is important, and that is that all of the opening work in progress costs must be taken into account, as well as all of the current year's costs. We add these together to get the total cost and we can add this together, as this is a control figure which we'll need later to check that we did our calculations correctly. So we have a total of 630,000 Rand coming into the process. Now this basically brings us to step 3, which is to calculate the equivalent units. Now remember, in process costing, calculating the individual cost of each individual product is not necessarily practical, nor is it necessary. So we are going to calculate an average cost. But for this average to be accurate, we need to have an accurate number of units to divide our costs by. So we're going to deal with what we call equivalent units. Important to remember is that step 3 now deals with units going out of the process. So we're still looking at our ingredients, raw material and conversion cost, but we want to see where did they go. In terms of units output, they either go to units completed and transferred or to closing work in progress. And here we'll add them together to get total equivalent units. Right. What's important here is that we're going to base these calculations on those units in our timeline, but they're not necessarily going to be the same amounts. We need to look at equivalent units. So, in terms of raw materials, how many units did we complete and transfer? There's not much thinking that has to go into this figure, because the name, or we call these units completed and transferred, so it is obvious that they are completed. We don't need to calculate an equivalent unit. However, when we have incomplete work, in other words, closing work in progress, we need to look at the percentage of completion. Now, if we go back to our timeline, something that I like to do is to color in the side of the timeline that is important. Now, when we're dealing with closing work in progress, we are interested in the work that was done. What did we do to get to that point? We started the production process here and we went along the process until we got to 85% and we stopped. This is not so important for this part of for this question, but once we get to losses, this technique becomes more important. Only things to the left of closing work in progress are going to be important. So, raw material is added at the beginning of process 1. Our closing work in progress is 85% complete, but raw material was added at once. The minute we cross that point where raw material was added, we can say that the closing work in progress is 100% complete in terms of raw material. So we're going to take that closing work in progress and the full 5,000 units are our equivalent units. Why? Because the raw material is added at once. So the minute we pass that point, all of the raw materials have been added. We reached a point of we have added the equivalent of 5,000. Conversion costs are different though, because conversion costs happen evenly throughout the process. If we start converting these units and we get up to 85% and then we stop, we can say that 5,000 units with 85% of the conversion done is equivalent to 4,250 units. Now we can add these together and we get 30,000 units, equivalent units for raw materials, and 29,250 units, equivalent units for conversion. Now we can calculate our cost per unit. Quite simply, we take the total cost divided by the total equivalent units, and we get a cost per unit, an average cost per unit for raw materials of 11 Rand 25, and an average cost per unit of 10 Rand for conversion, and an average cost per unit of 21 Rand and 25 cents for a completed product. Our last step is now to calculate the cost of the units that were actually completed and transferred, and the units that are still incomplete in our closing work in progress. Now it's very simple. We take the units over there, so the units completed and transferred are 25,000. What does it cost? It costs 21 Rand and 25 cents to make one unit, giving us a total cost of 531,250. Our closing work in progress consists of an equivalent of 5,000 raw material units at 11 Rand 25, and the equivalent of 4,250 conversion units at a cost of 10 Rand. And you add them both together to get to 98,750. Right, we're almost done. Just to check that we didn't make a mistake somewhere, we add the cost of the units completed and transferred to the cost of the units that were not completed, and this should add up to the 630,000 Rand that we had coming into the process. Right, so basically, if you look at it, we've accounted for units coming in and units going out, both the same. Rands coming in, rands coming out, both the same. Right, that was process 1. Now, we're going to need this piece of information, the cost of the units transferred out of process 1, to do process 2. We've already done the timeline, so we don't need to do it again. We can just immediately start calculating our rands coming into the process. Now remember, process 2 has a new ingredient, if you want to put it that way, or a new input, which is process 1. What came out of process 1 came into process 2. This is that 531,250 Rand that we calculated in the previous process. This is our current cost of process 2. The question also told us that there was an opening work in progress cost for process 1, which is 80,750. Just separate that. Right, then in process 2 we are going to add raw materials as we normally do. The opening work in progress has a cost of 70,400 and the current production 126,700. And the conversion, we are going to convert these inputs from process 1. The opening work in progress of conversion was 86,460 and the current cost is 309,300. These were all given. Now we add them together because we are still busy with the weighted average method, remember. So our total for process 1 is 612,000 Rand. Our total for raw material is 197,100, and our total for conversion 395,760, which adds together to a total input cost into the process of 1,204,860. Okay, this is fairly easy because all of those figures were given except for the current cost of process 1. The real trick in process costing is to correctly calculate the equivalent units, or step 3. Now these equivalent units are going to be done in exactly the same way as we did in process 1. When we deal with equivalent units, remember this is equivalent units going out of the process, we need to look at where do they go. They go to either units completed and transferred, or they go to closing work in progress or incomplete work. And then we're going to add those together to get our total equivalent units. Now, we need to look at our different inputs to see how complete they are in terms of equivalent units. Now, units completed in and transferred were given, and we have it on our timeline as being 21,900 units. The name tells you that these units are completed. So they are completed for any of the ingredients, if you want to call it that are in this process. They are completed in terms of the previous process, completed in terms of raw materials, and completed in terms of conversion. You don't need to spend too much time thinking about that figure. They are completed units. Then, something else that you don't need to worry about is the units transferred in from process 1. In terms of closing work in progress, they are also complete. How can we say that? We know because they come from the previous process. They are complete. They were completed in the previous process and transferred out. However, the raw materials that we added to them and the conversion that we did to those units coming in from process 1 are not necessarily complete. For them, we need to look at the timeline. So I'm going to open the timeline again. This was our previous process, but the timeline is on the top there. Remember, when we deal with closing work in progress, we are interested in the work that was done already. The work that was done from the beginning of process 2 up to the closing work in progress. If you look at this, you should see that the point where raw material was added does not fall within the area covered by the closing work in progress. What this means is we never added any raw materials to this closing work in progress. You can literally walk along the timeline. Tell yourself, we started here, we worked, and it was the close of the financial year. We stopped at 20%. Raw materials only gets added at 50%. So we added the equivalent of 0 raw materials. In terms of conversion, because conversion happens evenly throughout the process, we can say that 6,900 units that had 20% of the conversion done to them is equivalent to 1,380 units. That is 6,900 times 20%. Now we can add all of these. And then we can get our cost per unit. This cost per unit is the total input cost divided by the total equivalent units coming out of the process. In this question, because it's weighted average, we look at the total costs, which consists of both the opening work in progress and the current cost. So for process 1, it is 21 Rand and 25 cents. For raw material, it is 9 Rand per unit, and for conversion, it is 17 Rand per unit, giving us a total average product cost of one completed unit of 47 Rand and 25 cents. All we have left to do, step number 4, is to now account for the rands coming out of the process. So we're going to take our equivalent units in step 3, multiply them with those cost per units to get the cost of the units completed and transferred. Units completed and transferred are 21,900 at a cost of 47 Rand 25 cents per unit, giving us a total value or a total cost of 1,034,775 Rand. Now it is worth noting, where is this transferred to? It's completed, and this one is transferred to finished goods. Why? Because this was the last process. Output from process 1 became the input into process 2, but the output from process 2 became finished goods. We also need to find the cost of our closing work in progress, because we have all of these different inputs and all of them are at different levels of completion. We look at them separately for closing work in progress. In terms of process 1, we have 6,900 units that each cost 21 Rand and 25 cents, which gives us 146,625. In terms of raw material, we have 0. Why? Because we did not get to the point where raw materials are added. 0 times 9 is 0. I prefer to add this, even if you know that it's 0. Rather do not leave it out, because you're still showing the examiner that you know that nothing was incurred. If you leave it out, the examiner might wonder if you just forgot about it. Lastly, our conversion is the equivalent of 1,380 units at a cost of 17 Rand each, giving us 23,460. The total cost of our closing work in progress is going to be 170,085. And now, to test if we've worked correctly, we add the cost of the units completed to the cost of the units not completed, and we get 1,204,860. The total rands that came into the process equal the total rands that went out of the process. So that was the weighted average method.